Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, Gail. It is actually a great privilege to be in this society after many years of living overseas. And everything that Gail said about the importance of society in the modern world, I would underline. We do not have, I'm afraid, in our academic systems in this country, or indeed Australia or the United States, enough input from people who know about the natural world as opposed to things in test tubes. So I want to thank the Linnean Society, and particularly Gail, but also Katie, for making all the arrangements for today. And I also like to thank Hatchards, who will be sending the book upstairs later. But it's a particular pleasure to welcome Philip Watson, who is largely responsible for my writing this book. And he is at Thames and Hudson, who is my publisher for Citrus, A World History. It's also a great pleasure to see so many of my former pupils from both Oxford and Cambridge, and also many colleagues from places like Kew and other places that I've worked at during the course of my life. So let's get straight into it. Why are we talking about citrus fruits? Well, they are of enormous economic importance, and everybody is familiar with oranges and orange juice and so on, but I hope to be able to explain that it's a much bigger thing than that. But to just give you an example, a few years ago, the world commercial citrus production was 161 million tons. That's oranges and lemons and limes. That greatly exceeded, for example, apples at merely 93 million tons. And banana production was somewhere just a bit above that, at just over 120 million tons. So citrus reigns supreme when it comes to fruit industry. The other important thing is that citrus, in its broadest sense, is deeply embedded in culture of places across the world. And it, of course, is figures in the names of lots of places around the world. And I'll try and explain why that is. The talk I want to give is, in effect, rather like the book. It's a science sandwich, where the bread on the outside is the science, beginning and the end of the book. And the middle of the book is where all the beautiful pictures are, and it's all about the cultural history of that. And so in this lecture, I want to say a bit about the basic science first, then talk about the cultural history side of things, and then wind up with some rather distressing news from the scientific world about the future of the citrus industry, which is deeply disturbing. Okay, now one of the things that the Linnean Society do not allow you to do is to bring fresh fruit into this room. So I want you to do a bit of a thought experiment. If you are imagining yourself peeling one of these, this is a sweet orange. Now, the only fruits that can come in here are, of course, fermented, and we will have some of those upstairs. But as far as citrus goes, you're not going to get them in here. So let's imagine you have one in front of you, and you're starting to peel it. And that is the pericarp. That is the outer wall of the fruit. And it contains all kinds of aromatic substances. And the very reason that you can keep an orange or a lemon on a shelf for a very long time is because that peel contains substances which are antifungal, they're insecticidal, and also they are highly aromatic, and they are the basis for a number of important products, including things like eau de cologne. So there's this defensive mechanism which we have subverted in terms of the perfumery industry, but also the importance of these protective chemicals was one of the first reasons why Europeans grew them in the first place, not to eat, but to keep off insects. So once you get through the peel, you then get into what is called the mesocarp, the middle part of the fruit wall. And as you can see from that illustration from an 18th century book, it's composed of segments. So you think of yourself peeling this thing, and then you come to the segments. And inside the segments, of course, are the seeds. But they are surrounded by these funny little things. If you peel off the outside of the segment, you have all these finger-like things. Well, those are full of juice, which of course is medicinal also in the treatment of things like scurvy, contains a vast amount of vitamins, but it also keeps the seeds moist until it's time for them to germinate. And the finger-like things inside are actually hairs. They are hairs which occur in the ovary of the flower. And during the course of the development of the fruit, these hairs get pumped up with orange juice. So what you're eating most of the time then is juicy hairs. All right. Now, the important thing to say about the sweet orange, and indeed all the commercial kinds of citrus throughout the world, is that you can't find a wild one of those anywhere. There's no such thing as a wild orange or a wild lemon or a wild lime. They've escaped in some places, it is true, but you cannot go into the field and say, right, we're going to get some germplasm from wild lemons, for example. That does not exist. So I'd like to explain a bit about how they came about, their origins, as revealed by DNA studies carried out by me and colleagues in different parts of the world. And then I would like to try and explain the practical implications of this fresh knowledge, particularly in the light that most citrus growing countries, in the light of what is to most citrus growing countries going to be the greatest threat that there's ever been to the citrus industry, namely a disease with the Chinese name of huanglongbing, formerly known as citrus greening. But let's go to the very beginning. There's great debate as to where citrus began. A lot of biogeographers are conflicted about this, but we think now that it's something to do with something that looks like the plant on the screen, which is an African species of the family of Rutaceae, the genus Citropsis, which, as you can see, has a pinnate leaf. And if you think about an orange or other citrus fruit that you would buy fresh, it has a little joint at the base of the leaf. People would say that was a broad petiole. But in fact, what it is, as you can see, is representing part of a pinnate leaf. So what you've got with a simple orange leaf is the tip of a pinnate leaf. So we think that the typical rutaceous pinnate leaf form is the primitive version from which citrus has been derived. It is likely that the citrus ancestors spanned Pangaea, Gondwana, and that they have moved, rafted northwards into Asia, such that today the two great centers for citrus diversity are the China region on the one hand, and you will see very importantly as we go along, Australasia. All right. Now, the first one which was known to Europe was the citron, Citrus medica. It's nothing to do with medicine, although it is medicinal. It's named after the Medes, as the Medes and Persians, because the Greeks moving into India encountered the citron, and they brought it. Traditionally, it's associated with Alexander the Great, but probably not him himself or his own troops. But around that time, the citron was introduced from India into the Middle East. And it is a plant which is not grown much in orangeries or so on anywhere, but it is the source of candied peel. Now, the citron, Citrus medica, we are not certain where it came from. There is no place in the world where you can absolutely say, here is a wild stand of citron. People think that it was perhaps northeast India. It is one of 25 thorny species of tree which grow citrus, which grow naturally in the wild from South Australia northwards as far as China and extending east into the Pacific to New Caledonia and west, probably in this one, to northeast India. But the region with the highest number of indigenous citrus species is in fact Australasia, and we did not know that until I started my own research, where they'd all been classified in other genera. Now, if we try and see how these things fit together from phylogeny, you can see here this one derived from plastid DNA to the right and one from nuclear DNA on the left. I'm sorry, the other way around. And they come out as slightly different, as you can see. But the overall picture is that the ones at the top are the Asian ones. Citrus trifoliata is one which is used as a rootstock and is native in China. Citrus japonica, that is the kumquat, the one that you eat all the peel with. And then you have Citrus reticulata, which is the mandarin, Citrus cavalieri, which is a rainforest tree from northern India and southwest China, and Citrus hystrix, which many of you will be familiar with as lime leaves of cooking. You know, you buy these things, you see it in Thai food, this kind of thing which looks like two leaves stuck together. This is the broadened petiole I was talking about. Now, those are all Asian species. And then Citrus maxima is the pomelo, which is the one with the big fruit like this. And then all ones further down, at the very bottom, are the Australian ones. And you can see there's some debate as to where Citrus medica citron fits in. But that's the overall picture of the phylogeny of the genus. Okay. Now, this thing that looks like a kind of dirigible flying above the village in Germany is another citrus, sweet orange. Now, you can see there the vertical section of it in this 18th century drawing. The longevity of the fruits, which I referred to just now, means that plants can be successfully introduced to countries far from their native lands. More significantly, they can be brought into contact with other citrus species previously geographically isolated. Because they last a long time, you can take them somewhere else. And then the fruit keeping properties and these human movements allow them to come together. So when they grow up and they flower, then you can get cross-pollination by bees. And so what is happening is you get natural hybridization occurring spontaneously in Asia in particular, and sometimes subsequently and sometimes intentionally in the orangeries and botanic gardens of Europe. Now, all citrus species have 18 chromosomes, and interspecific hybrids are readily formed. But hybrids, citrus, are not sterile. They can set seeds. This is because embryos arise directly from asexual tissue, 18 chromosomes, so that desirable forms can readily be propagated from seeds as predictably stable, pure lines. So these hybrids can be fixed through a system of apomixis. Moreover, there are chance mutants in other asexual tissues, bud mutants, and these can be fixed in a similar way. In addition, such plants can occasionally undergo normal sexual reproduction and form hybrids with one another, yielding yet other of these stable forms, which are in effect reproducing as clones. Now, this was realized a very long time ago by the great pioneer of microscopy, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, in the Netherlands. And this is a sketch of what he found with germinating a citrus seed at the end of the 17th century. And he sent this to the Royal Society, his drawing, and he sent it from Amsterdam one Thursday evening, and it was in the Royal Society on Friday morning. And I don't think you could do better than that today. But you can see, if you look in the tube there, you can see a seed which has two embryos. And what is happening is that these apomictic things, they can actually have more than one embryo per seed. This is a phenomenon of polyembryony, which was first recorded from citrus by him. He, of course, had no notion of the fact that these were apomictic clones, but that's the first indication of a scientific investigation into this phenomenon. Now, the truly wild species underlying the modern citrus industry through these hybridizations are the true wild mandarin, Citrus reticulata, the pomelo, which I mentioned just now, the big one, Citrus maxima, which we think comes from southern China, the citron, as I mentioned, Citrus medica, and the macrut lime or the lime leaves from the Malay archipelago. Now, these things can all hybridize, so please hold your breath and you'll see how they are related. As you can see, it's rather complicated. So let's take this a bit at a time. Citrus reticulata, the original wild mandarin, is native in just a few mountain ranges in southern China. It's endangered, It has very small fruits with a very thin peel. It's rather sweet. Whereas the pomelo is the big boy with this big fruit with, you can see, a very thick peel, and it is probably water dispersed. And it probably was native in Vietnam, in the areas which were so rigorously destroyed during the Vietnam War by our allies, the Americans, to such an extent that the original forest where it grew probably no longer persist. Perversely, the substance they used to do the defoliating was called Agent Orange. Now, natural hybridization, as I say, occurred spontaneously between these two in Asia, and sometimes intentionally in other places. And the cross between these two gives us, as you can see in the middle, citrus, little X showing a hybrid, oranges and grapefruits. Dependent on how much of a dose of mandarin you have or how much of a dose of pomelo, you have that whole range from sweet to sour oranges and grapefruits, which grapefruits are much nearer the pomelo end. All right, so where does citrus medica fit in? So here it is at the bottom. This is an illustration from a collection of the King of Australia, who I gather lives somewhere around here. And that gives us the lemon. So what you've got is that the lemon, the dirigible up top right there, and the flowers at the bottom, as you can see, it is a cross between the citron from from northeast India, and this hybrid mess of oranges and grapefruits, which are crosses between the mandarin and the pomelo. So it has three parents. And therefore, if you have different forms hybrids between different forms of the citrus aurantium complex, you will have sweet lemons and bitter lemons and so on, and bergamots. And these, of course, are bergamot in particular, you'll be familiar with from Earl Grey tea, but also from eau de cologne. So lemons then have three parents. So on we go. Here is our friend, the lime leaves, which is Citrus hystrix, its name at the bottom there. And so how does that fit in? Well, it crosses with the citron to give us the lime. So the lime, again, is a hybrid. So all three then, oranges, lemons, and limes, are all hybrids with at least two species in their parentage. So Citrus aurantiifolia, the lime, is a cross between Citrus hystrix from the Malaysian area and Citrus medica from India. Now this lime, is we're all familiar with it, and key lime pie and so forth, and gin and tonic and all the rest of it. You're probably not familiar with it like that. This is in Sri Lanka and is in a Hindu festival where these chaps have these things hooked onto them, and it actually acts as a pain reduction. So let's move on. We've got now, if you can see in the middle, the Tahitian lime. Now this is the one which is illustrated in the top right, and you can see it has no seeds. And that, of course, is what people prefer in their gin and tonic. They don't want to be having these pips. But it is triploid. It has three sets of chromosomes, and it is a cross between the real lime and the lemons. So it has got, if you count them up, it's got 5 parents. Then what about the kumquat? Where does that fit in? So this is the one where you eat the whole fruit. It crosses with the mandarin to give us the calamondin, which is largely grown in this country as an ornamental. But if you go to the Philippines, it is the soft drink, calamansi, and you get it in bottles in Manila and such places. And then those of you who are interested in gin, one or two perhaps, Rangpur. This is now all the rage here in London to have Rangpur gin. Well, that is from this so-called rough lemon. A Rangpur lime is just a cultivar, selected form of this, which is a cross between the citron and the mandarin. And then there is this thing which I mentioned before, Citrus cavalieri from the forests of southwest China and northeast India, which has, as you can see, it's kind of double-barreled leaf. And if you cross it into this system, you end up with the yuzu. Now that is another, of course, trendy thing. Everything is being drizzled with yuzu in the best restaurants. And you can see that is a cross between the mandarin and the Yichang papeda or Citrus cavalieri. Now you'll notice that Citrus reticulata is linked to almost all of these things, and yet it is extremely rare in the wild. And I'll come back to that point towards the end of my talk if I have time. Okay, so we're almost there with filling in all the puzzle now. Citrus trifoliata I mentioned before is used as a rootstock in the same way that you would graft grapes or so on. And it, as you can see, has 3 leaflets, so it's hence the name trifoliata. And how does that fit in? It crosses with the orange and grapefruit section to give a thing called the citrange, which is perhaps the most familiar rootstock in commerce today. So if you are growing a citrus in a pot, sometimes you get shoots coming out of the base, and they have 3 leaflets. That's this thing. And you can go on. So there are things called lime quats and citrange quats and orange quats involving the kumquat as hybrids. And then you can bring the Australian ones in. And the finger lime, for instance, is now very trendy everywhere because its vesicles, remember the juice-containing hair cells, they're spherical. And that's the so-called vegetable caviar, which they're also serving in trendy restaurants here in London. But you can see it can cross with calamondin to give a thing called the sunrise lime, and is the first hybrid involving Australian species was made in the Sydney Botanic Garden between Citrus australis and Citrus australasica. Okay, so that's a quick run through of, as it were, the first part of the science. The story, in essence, is that everything in commerce is a hybrid, and hybrids are still being made in commerce. The other important thing to remember is that many of these parental species, we don't know where they are wild, or they are very, very reduced. Now, I want to say something about the importance of this in cultural history. And as you can see here, here's these Jewish people at the Feast of the Tabernacles. And this is a Chagall picture, because the citron is a very important plant for Jewish people. And it is one of the things which is waved during the course of this ceremony of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And special boxes are made for you to get one of these, and you have to have them. Many Jewish people here will be able to tell you much more than I can about it, but they have to be perfect with a stalk, and they mustn't be blemished or anything, and they are put in silver boxes. This is a very important plant for Jewish people. So if we consider other forms of Citrus medica, some of you will be familiar with this, which is now grown a lot as an ornamental in Europe, the so-called Buddha's hand, which is a mutant form of Citrus medica. And like Citrus medica, when introduced first of all, it is used to put amongst clothes to keep moths away. So what I was saying, that the first citrus were introduced into Europe, not to eat, but as insecticidal plants. And this form actually is very interesting because you can get the similar morphological result from infection with a mite, which seems to turn on the same mutation as in this peculiar thing. But for Chinese people, this is very important. And so if you go to the National Museum in Taipei, in Taiwan, for example, you'll find these beautiful things made out of jade, which are models of the hand, but it is based on a citrus. And if you go nearby into Japan, it is very important. Citrus, there's a so-called native citrus, Citrus tachibana, which figures, you can see the thing at the bottom is a citrus flower. And this is the order of cultural merit. The only problem with this is that although Japanese people get very excited about it, and I have been to see trees, which is very rare in Japan, in fact, it's a hybrid, and wait for it, between two Chinese species. And then we come to Europe, and this is somewhat debated, but this is the coat of arms of the Medici family, and it contains these spheres. And people have argued, and people have argued against, that they may be citruses. Undoubtedly, as we'll see as we go along, the Medici were very interested in citruses. So it's not an unreasonable thing, because these things were also a sign of wealth. If you could grow these things in greenhouses, orangeries, you were somebody. So in a lot of Renaissance pictures, we find citruses. That rather scraggly tree with a bird on the right, that is a citrus in this wonderful picture from Milan. But one of the most famous pictures in the world is this, by Botticelli, and you can see there that what that little puto is flying amongst is citrus. And this is thought to represent the Medici family, perhaps because of this business about the arms, but also, again, to show richness and also the flowers of citrus, which were concerned with purity. And right the way up until the 19th century, brides would carry citrus blossom in their corsage. Another one which indicates the great significance to people with respect to the importance of them as a sign of riches. This, and yet another very famous picture, of course, Van Eyck, the Arnolfini portrait, which people initially thought was a wedding portrait, which is rather unfortunate in view of the lady on the right. But it is now thought to perhaps to have been a memorial to her because she died in childbirth. But if you look to the left of the male on the windowsill, you can see there some citruses. And this was a rich merchant family in the Low Countries. And this was a sign that they were doing okay because they were able to grow citruses. And when we consider the Dutch, it's inevitable we have to consider the House of Orange. This is William of Orange, who founded my university, the University of Leiden, as a present for keeping the Spanish at bay. Not many universities can claim that. But anyway, the House of Orange, Orange Nassau, which is the royal house of the Netherlands, I have to explain at once, is nothing to do with oranges. This is all a terrible confusion. The Orange Nassau family comes from the south of France, from the city of Orange, which is nothing to do with oranges. It's from Orazio, an old Celtic name, and it commemorates a water god. So this was a joke that when William of Orange came to the Netherlands and he needed a color for his standards and so forth, well, why not orange? And so from then on, everything to do with Holland is orange. You know, when you go there, they're waving orange flags all the time. And of course, inevitably, you have the Orange men. When the Orange family became the monarchs in Britain, and the whole of the Orange Order and all of that is based on this mistake. Now, in terms of wealth, perhaps the greatest orangery ever built was that for Louis XIV at Versailles. And here you can see a picture of it at the end of the 17th century. And he was so keen on having fresh orange blossom all the time, not very interested in the fruit, but he always wanted to have his apartments. You must remember how smelly these people were. They wanted to have scented flowers around the place. And so he wanted to have orange flowers all the year round. Now, of course, these things tend to flower in the spring. So what you do in the autumn and winter. And what he did, he got his gardeners to starve these trees and not give them any water until they'd almost died. and then water them. And then, of course, they flower. So if you do this in a staged way through the year, you can get these poor trees to actually flower at any time of the year. So he could have his orange blossom all the year round. So if you have an orangery, you can do that. I'm sure you do. And then this is one which is in Weimar in Germany, and it is still in the original buildings and still in use as it was intended. And this orangery was one which was studied by no less than Goethe. All right, so that's, it's got into, as people were getting more and more oranges, wanted orangeries. You think of the orangery at Kew, which is one of the worst oranges in the world because it's too dark to grow oranges. That's why it's a cafe now. But then the whole idea of being spread to the New World. And so, of course, the Portuguese took citruses to South America, and then the Spanish did as well. And when the Europeans moved into North America, they, of course, took their orange ideas with them. So this is why there's two versions of the flag of New York, which has got orange on, because, of course, it was originally a Dutch colony. And so this orange business is now all over the US. And even more so with respect to this kind of art, which figures very largely in my book. I mean, Thames and Hudson did a grand job in getting together no end of wonderful illustrations for me. And this rather fetching one is from the end of an orange box. There was a whole kind of oeuvre of orange box art in the 20th century. It's now finished because they're putting cardboard boxes, not in wooden boxes with these labels on the end. So into modern commercial art, all the way from Renaissance pictures. I haven't had time to show you pictures from the ancient world, but rest assured that from the time of Alexander the Great and onwards, Roman mosaics and all the rest of it, there were citrus. Now I want to tell you a little bit about more modern times. This person, as you can see, Walter Swingle, was special agent, and he was appointed by what's now the Department of Agriculture in the United States, what's ever left of it now, and as a special agent to do something about the fact that people began to realize that the genetic basis for the citrus industry was very narrow, as I was explaining, all these things now very rare. And so he had lots of expeditions to Asia to collect things, but largely not from the wild, but from cultivation. So he never really got to the basis of the problem, because at that time, people didn't understand that there was no such thing as a wild orange or a wild lemon or a wild lime. So he was just collecting things which were already in cultivation. Nevertheless, he set in train the idea that you need to start collecting germplasm. He started in Florida and then moved on to California. Now, I thought I'd just bring you up to date with some modern art before I come back to the science again. This is Salvador Dali. As you can see, it's in effect, well, typical of his work. But this is actually a mutilated picture from a book published in the 1840s in France. And you can see these usual sort of Dahlia sort of erotica. And then we can move on to this by Philip Stark. As you can see from the story I put on here, this thing was made in 1990, and it's in the Museo d'Orsay in Italy. And the original sketches for this were done on a napkin, paper napkin, when he was eating calamari with lemons. And as he says, the design was indeed squid-like, but it was considered impractical. If any of you have got these, they're kind of collector's items, but they're no good at squeezing them. And Stark himself said it's not meant to squeeze lemons. It's meant to start conversations. And then this by Joseph Beuys, very famous limited edition of this the Cadbury Battery 1985, you see, there's a kind of joke in this as well. The idea that you can generate power from citruses. Okay, well, that's all the good stories so far, and I now need to come to the bad news. As you can see, this is a quote. Some of you at the back obviously won't be able to read it, so I'll read it out. This is from a website in 2012. That's 13 years ago. And it says, citrus green disease, also known as huanglongbing, is one of the most severe plant diseases in the world. Once a tree is infected with the disease, there is no known cure. Although the disease is not harmful to humans, fruits from infected trees are not suitable for consumption because of their green color, and shape and appearance, and bitter taste. The disease has devastated millions of citrus trees in the United States. All that is true 13 years on. There is no known cure. So what is all this? Huanglongbing is a bacterial disease which is spread by this insect, the bottom right, which is just a few millimeters long. This is a psyllid, Diaphorina citri. And what it does, it has bacteria in its system, and they can reproduce inside the insect. The insect has generation time of 2.5 weeks and produces thousands of offspring. So you can imagine in a season how many of these there are going to be. Here are some of the symptoms. There's misshapen and it's discoloring. And then what happens is that the tree goes bright yellow. And huanglongbing, Chinese, means yellow dragon disease. Suddenly, you know, plantation, you've got this tree go bright yellow and die. And why does it do that? Because the insect inserts, whilst feeding on the citrus thing, it has this kind of double pump mechanism, as you know, with insects, and it puts bacteria into the tree. The bacteria then multiply in the phloem of the tree. But a tree being very clever, in the same way that if you try and ring bark a tree, unless you completely ring bark it, the tree reorganizes its pipework, and so that the phloem is still functional. So until the very last phloem sieve tube is full of bacteria, the tree will look fine. And then suddenly one day, that's it. It goes yellow and dies. So this disease is the worst thing that's ever happened to the citrus industry. So it's worth looking at it in some detail, I think. The most widespread vector, this thing, the Asiatic citrus psyllid, is now a worldwide pest of citrus. It's been recorded from even the most isolated of archipelagos, Hawaii. The eggs are laid on the growing shoot tips by the insects. And I told you the rate of reproduction of the insects is such that plant is soon covered with these things and being pinpricked all over with bacteria. Although it was long considered that the disease arose in China, it now seems it's highly unlikely that that is the case, despite the fact it's been given a Chinese name. The very fact that there is no resistance whatsoever in edible Chinese species of citrus suggests that it has jumped from some other kind of plant. And the evidence seems to be coming together that in fact the bacteria associated with huanglongbing originated in Africa in association with indigenous African trees in the same family, Rutaceae. The Asian citrus psyllid, this insect, would appear to have originated in India and spread almost worldwide from there since the 1800s. Its dispersal to Southeast Asia in the 19th century was only recorded in mainland China in 1934, for instance. It had been known in Southeast Asia before that. And it got to the Americas in the 1900s, followed by Africa in the 2010s. So this insect was all around. The spread of the bacterium has meant that the most severe form of the disease now occurs in the Americas, besides throughout much of the tropical and subtropical Asia, east to New Guinea, and west to the islands of the Indian Ocean, and now Africa itself. The severe form of this disease has prevented the establishment of a modern viable citrus industry in Asia. As I say, it was first recorded in Papua New Guinea, and it was first recorded there in 2002. By September 2004, it was found in Brazil, and is now rampant in South and Central America, as well as in the southern United States, where it was first found in Florida in 1998. The psyllid and its disease soon reached Louisiana, then Texas, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. In August 2008, the psyllid was found in San Diego, California, perhaps coming from Mexico. Today, it is found throughout the citrus-growing parts of Florida, where it is spread to affect 80% of the orange groves. The citrus industry in Florida is doomed, and most of the orange juice that you buy in the United States is now imported. The disease will see off the Florida industry, which was worth $9 billion a year. Today, nowhere in the world is there an effective management regime for this disease in terms of treatment of infected plants or prevention of infection to healthy ones. People have tackled the bacterium, they've tackled the insect, they've tackled various kinds of plant cultivation regimes. They've tried different kinds of insecticide. They've tried different kinds of injecting with what they think of as will kill the bacteria, bactericidal compounds by injection. None of this has worked. The upshot of it is that the Florida economy, which is largely, besides tourism, is largely based on this, is now in free fall. And people are abandoning these citrus groves. So you drive for mile upon mile, as I did just a few weeks ago, it's just dead trees. People are abandoning the land. There is no cash crop which can actually give them the same kind of return. So they're leaving. But they're not only leaving, but they're leaving behind dead and dying trees, which are acting as a focus of infection for those trees which are still healthy. Now, there is a little bit of good news, because so far the psyllid, and therefore the disease, has not become established in the Mediterranean or Australia. Although, as I say, it's in New Guinea, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump from the northern part of Australia, it is not established there. It's difficult to explain this, because quarantine in Europe is much more lax than it is in most parts of the world. So you'd think that it would readily get introduced into the Mediterranean. So there's something about the Mediterranean ecosystem, and maybe true also of the Mediterranean parts of Australia, that is inimical to either the bacterium or the insect, maybe both. This means that countries in the Mediterranean will be at a competitive advantage with respect to the citrus industry in future. Places like Morocco, Egypt is now one of the leading exporters of citrus. Israel, of course, always had Jaffa oranges. But when I was there just recently, in fact, just a few days before the terrible things that have happened there, they were saying, no, we're not going to be growing this anymore because we want Israel to be the Singapore of the Mediterranean. This is old-fashioned growing these things. And I said, well, that would be all very well, but what about food security? And it would be all very well if the people who lived around you were very happy to let them have your food, but I don't think that is the case. Nevertheless, it means that not everybody is a loser on this so far, but the countries which we've become familiar with as sources of these things are suffering very much. As it stands, as I said, no citrus, hybrid or wild, of the cultivated ones is resistant completely to the disease, but there is some tolerance in some of the Australasian species, which, as I explained at the beginning, weren't even put in the genus Citrus before I started my work. So here is a postage stamp showing one of the species, which, as you can see from its name, grows in arid regions. And you'll notice that it has the spherical kind of vesicles in the same way that the finger lime does, which is the next one, which is the so-called vegetable caviar. Now, hybrids between these have been raised, and therefore it is hoped that those with some strains with some kind of resistance, that genes for this resistance can be transferred to the commercial crops. But this will take a very long time. This shows the first hybrid that was made between two Australian species. This was made in my garden, not my garden, the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney, between two Australis and Australasica. But there are species which have not been brought into cultivation, which have much bigger fruits. And this is a species from New Caledonia. Here its flowers. And this may have some resistance, but also have a fruit which is of some commercial interest. But my colleague in Israel wrote this just a couple of years ago. It was, due to a limited or non-existent seed supply for most new disease-resistant or tolerant rootstocks, micropropagation will be necessary to produce the millions of trees needed for replant efforts following HRV devastation. The challenges to maintaining a profitable and sustainable worldwide citrus industry have never been greater, and applications of the emerging biotechnologies will play a critical role for future success. And we're nowhere near it. They've tried crossing with other genera related to citrus. This is with an African genus, which may show some resistance. But as it stands at the moment, there is no place where you can say, all right, we've now got CRISPRed genes into citruses, which are going to be viable commercially. And then we come back to the basics, that what about these wild ones? Where are they? What are they doing? I already indicated that some of them are extremely rare in the wild. So citrus, this is Citrus gracilis, had the honor of naming, found from the top end of Northern Australia. This exists in just 2 stands, and the local people have decided that they will protect them. The citrus is on the left. And here in southern China, this is a wild population of kumquat, Citrus japonica, with one of my happy colleagues there. So that is protected. And then a colleague in northeastern India, this is with Citrus indica, which is a close relation of the citron, which is otherwise not known in the wild. So what I'm trying to say is that there is some good news that some of these wild species are being protected, but most of the news, both in terms of the cultivated things and our efforts to do something about it, and the notion of what the wild parental species are doing, is not looking very bright. But I'm sorry I'm going to leave you there, but